Dream machine. DICOM, HL7, I18 in the snap. We're building the future, never looking back.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome back to Imaging Informatics Unplugged. I'm Jason Nagels, and my guest today is Michael Rosenberg. He's co-founder and CEO of Medicom Technologies. Michael and his co-founders started Medicom back in 2015 out of North Carolina State University to solve one of imaging's oldest problems, getting medical images to actually move across institutions instead of riding around on a CD. He is an industrial and systems engineer by training, and Michael spends his days sitting between Medicom's engineering team and the nation's leading IDNs and academic medical centers. And today, Medicom's platform runs across every VA medical center in the country. We get into why the ACR's Ditch the Disc campaign never fully delivered, why 3-point patient matching is a bigger safety issue than most of us realize, and what happens when image sharing moves beyond radiology into things like pathology, cardiology, and oncology. Stick around for the back half where Michael breaks down regulatory changes coming from CMS and the ONC that could finally make interoperability a requirement instead of a nice to have. And if this gets you thinking about your own career, check out nagelsconsulting.com. We have our Imaging Informatics Primer course. We have CIIP Foundations material to help prepare you for the exam. We have an all-new hands-on DICOM Learning Lab with a lesson included at nagelsconsulting.com. And with all that said, let's jump into the episode with Michael Rosenberg. Thank you very much, Michael. I appreciate you joining me today for this episode of Imaging Informatics Unplugged.
Jason, great to be here. Excited to talk about the issue that we're so passionate about, which is interoperability of enterprise imaging data. And I know we've got a full docket, so really excited about some of the topics we're going to cover today.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I'm based in Canada and we had a conversation a couple of weeks ago. And, you know, in Canada, we've accomplished a lot of foreign exam management, as we call it, or image sharing, but it's not something front and center on people's minds. It's a bit of the plumbing in the background until you have to bring in one of those CDs or, you know, until you're tasked with bringing in physical media from one location to the other. And so maybe that's a good starting point of this conversation when we talk about interoperability and image exchange and sharing. A few years back, there was the ACR Ditch the Disc campaign. And so it was a noble effort to try to get rid of the disc. But in my opinion, I thought there was a lot of focus on eliminating the physical disc, but many of the solutions that allow you to do that would require a human being to reconcile and create an order and make sure that it was going to file into the local patient jacket properly. So maybe we could start just kind of grade the ACR's Ditch the Disc movement, and it was focused on transport. What do you think it got right? What do you think it maybe could have done better at, and where do you think we are today?
Well, first of all, Jason, I think, you know, this world of having sort of a HIPAA-compliant Dropbox for image exchange is going to go away very quickly because you and I could probably vibe code in a weekend, something where you could upload some DICOM, have a little DIMSY DICOM listener, and then you're off to the races. I think that as we continue to see this area within enterprise imaging progress and grow, the focus, just as you said, is going to be on the workflow. When we talk about the workflow, it's about surfacing the right insights to the right clinician. You know, you think about that image exchange being really about the image producers, you know, radiologists and sometimes even cardiology. But, you know, we fail to think about all of the different consumers of imaging data and the various workflow needs that they have. But, you know, going to this ACR Ditch the Disc, you know, I'm going to grade it and do my best to think about this issue. But, you know, let me start out by saying that the ACR does a lot of public policy work. And, you know, they're constantly going to the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. They're talking with the ONC. And in many respects, they've been a very effective public policy agent or entity on behalf of radiologists across the country. And so when we saw the ACR Ditch the Disc initiative come forward, it really contained the messaging and excitement for radiologists about getting rid of physical media, but it wasn't backed up by the same sort of regulatory or policy changes that are really required to get people to make changes in their workflow. We think about the American Recovery and Reconstruction Act establishing the meaningful use criteria. And for a long time, radiology practices, outpatient radiology practices, didn't meet the definition of an eligible provider in an office or a hospital. They didn't have those same mandates to adopt an ONC certified EHR. And so, the concept of interoperability being at the core of a mandate really never entered the ideas of radiologists or radiology practices. And so, that's really where we think the American College of Radiology fell short. It started with great messaging, but then it should have been backed up by policy and advocacy work to try to come up with penalties and incentives. We're still in a position today where information blocking hasn't completely codified how to handle imaging data. And so that disparity exists today. Jason, as we were talking about last week in Ontario, in the early 2000s, they put forth the government funding to build these handful of archives. Those archives became sort of a duplicate system of record and then were available for image sharing workflows. And so we just haven't had that type of public investment. And I think the American College of Radiology really thought that the private markets would work this out. But at the end of the day, when you have a bunch of different networks that are closed and not sharing with each other, we're not fully embodying or embracing the spirit of interoperability. And so that's really where things need to head and go forward. And that's what we really want the ACR to do, is be a big advocate for public policy change.
We're going to circle back to what you said about the early stages of when Canada was getting going. They had this vision, one patient, one record, and we'll circle back to that in a moment. You did mention the focus on interoperability. And so for something to be interoperable, there's an expectation that there's not a lot of friction in getting the piece of information that I need from one system to another system. And so that requires some sort of automated reconciliation of the priors. I think people underestimate, that have not operated in this space, how difficult that really is. And so you're dealing with a local patient ID versus a foreign patient ID. I might be Jay somewhere, I might be Jason somewhere else. And if my name doesn't reconcile in the local PACS, depending on what it is, maybe it won't go in the jacket. So I'd like to hear you talk through the nuances around all the different permeations that need to be handled, what you do as an organization to consider all of the variety to what can be expected on the inbound PACS that's the recipient, and what it requires. And one PACS versus another can be very different. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on the terminology side as well. So when we think about semantic interoperability, and my other organization may call it a chest and I call it a thorax here, how do we make sure that everything's reconciled appropriately?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think in DICOM and DICOM image sharing, as I'll talk about the category a little bit, people accept 3-point patient matches. And it's really our opinion as an organization that that is an unsafe thing to do. The problem is that a lot of systems of record, a lot of the PACS and VNAs don't support taking the ADT message that got the study originally on the work list and then writing things like the patient's home address or phone number or email address into the DICOM. And so what you have to work with is 3 points. We do have some systems that rely on 3 points of match in certain sort of controlled and safe conditions. But ultimately, we plan on phasing out all 3-point patient matches within the next year because we don't see that it's safe for patients to rely on that. And I think the large EHR companies generally agree with this concept as well. You shouldn't, as you talked about earlier, for a clinician to have the relevant insights surface to them from an imaging study, it needs to be within the patient's chart in the EHR. And we really should not enter automatically any data into the EHR that's based on 3 points of match. One of the techniques that we use is when an organization shares an imaging study, we use that organization's EMPI and a FHIR endpoint to query their EHR to search for additional demographics. We call that app append, and it's a simple concept. It's, when you share images, whether it be with another clinician, a patient, a law office, a medical device manufacturer that needs to make a prosthetic, whatever the situation might be, we attempt using FHIR to grab the patient's home address, their email address, and their phone number. When that data then arrives at another institution, they can use our patient match app, which instead of querying the a DICOM system of record, we're creating the EHR with all the points of identification we have. There have been some vendors in the PACS and VNA space who have graciously added those additional demographics into their DICOM headers. So now that when an ADT message creates the patient in the PACS, or maybe even an ORM creates the patient in the PACS, instead of just discarding those very helpful demographics, they're writing them to the DICOM. And so for those institutions, they don't even need to use our additional FHIR app that appends those additional demographics. Jason, our hope is that the vast majority of patient matches over the next year that happen automatically on our platform that then lead to an order being created or a viewer link being dropped into the EHR are based on 4 or 5 points of match. And we're pushing very hard for that. And we've opened up these FHIR apps to be free because we don't want costs to be a barrier for people to have a safe patient match. I mean, that is a ridiculous concept in our world. So that's really what our perspective is. And, we really want to implore the broader enterprise imaging ecosystem to embrace additional demographics as most EHR and other system of record systems have.
That's very fascinating. I like the way you frame that, the 3-point match versus, a richer way of matching that. And I'm coming in from this question as an outsider. In Canada, we have central VNAs or within a particular region or a particular province. In Europe, it's a similar type of model. It may not be centrally hosted images, but there's XDS infrastructure that there is a regional source of truth, so to speak. In the US, it's very different. In the US, there's a lot more silos. And I'd like to hear a bit about the trigger of what motivates image data to have to travel from one organization to the next. Is it typically patient-driven? Are there partnerships between different providers?
First of all, we've had the great experience of getting to work with the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. And, our software is technically installed in every VA medical center or VA healthcare facility across all their service areas and regions, now called HSAs. They used to be called VISNs. And, that's given us a unique insight into what a sort of national program for healthcare can do and what the power of doing that can be. There are 9 million veterans, there are 7 million with a service-connected injury, and there are several million, probably somewhere between 4 and 5 million that are getting healthcare annually from VA, and many of those are complex medical questions related to service connected injuries, and so there's imaging that goes along with that. And so we have seen VA kind of go through this same transformation here in the United States, where they're moving from, regional archives to a national centralized archive, and there's a RFI and RFP that have been posted about that right now. So we're going to get to see what happens when a model like the ones we've seen in other countries, mostly in Europe and Canada, gets implemented across VA. But it's also given us a lot of unique insight into how you can do matching, how you can present relevant insights to clinicians when you do have a master patient index that represents the whole population of people that you're caring for. In the case of VA, they have social security numbers as their patient ID. And so obviously that serves and can serve as an additional point of match to identify an individual. Not saying social security numbers are perfect. There's lots of individual and specific problems about that. But on your bigger question, it's our belief that while the patient should have complete control to share their images, upload their images, get ready for an appointment, share their images with a friend or family member or with a lawyer or whatever they want to do, that they should have the tools available to them to do that, and not in a separate portal, but directly inside their EHR provided patient portal from the institution that they're getting care from. But ultimately, we can't tell the patient, hey, this is your responsibility. Have to work with health systems to make it their primary responsibility. And then the patient being able to share is something that's great to have on top. It's our view that as we think about use and access, and I use those words very specifically, especially with the changing regulatory framework around imaging operability, that use and access should mean AI systems as well. That it shouldn't be, hey, I have to call Johnny in the file room and request the images and then wait for them to get back to me and then fulfill the request and get the release of information. That instead, we should use the information about upcoming appointments to determine what data is out there on the patient, determine which of that data set is relevant, and then retrieve that so that the clinician with really no touch has access to those prior images. Now, in practice, this is a very hard thing to do, but there are model institutions where they've done a fantastic job. For example, the University of Michigan, Michigan Medicine Health System in Ann Arbor. It started with Ann Arbor and spread to Michigan West and the legacy Sparrow system. Every time they schedule a radiology procedure, we're searching pretty much all the other health systems in the state of Michigan. And they've been incredibly good partners to go out and have these conversations with the other health systems. The other thing, people are nervous about sort of opening up their systems of record for this type of automated retrieval of data. But there are a couple of interesting considerations. The first of which is that there is a provenance that goes with the release of that information. So, for example, Jason, if your record was released from, say, Hurley, who also uses Smart Search in Flint, Michigan, to Michigan Medicine, there's an audit trail that says, Jason, he got a CT of his shoulder and the system automatically shared the images related to that body part, right? That's probably a lot more documentation than if somebody got a fax, released your images, put a little note in their EHR that says continuity of care, and then went upon their merry way. And so I think, the first thing is there's a much more detailed chain of custody when you're relying on automated systems and the upcoming appointments and procedures. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we're using AI to determine what's relevant for that upcoming appointment. When we think about making disclosure of EPHI or any sort of EHI in general, you want to make the minimum disclosure possible for that continuity of care. So, the CT of the head isn't relevant. But just as you said earlier, there isn't great adoption of the RADLEX playbook or LOINC for defining radiology procedures. And so, without AI, it's very difficult to understand this procedure at one health system means this procedure at another system is relevant or not. Back before generative AI was really massively available, we built compendiums with our health system customers to say, okay, you got this procedure code, that's this body part, laterality, study description, modality. And then you got to build the regular expressions that say, if you have this body part modality, there's opportunity for human error in there. People are constantly changing their procedure descriptions. There's overhead. It's hard to implement, that sort of thing. Fast forward to today, you can kind of just hook up your HL7 SIU feed and we can figure out what's going on and the AI figures it out. It took a lot of training, and there are specific physicians who I'd be remiss for not calling out, like Dr. Cheryl Petersilge, who helped us train those models and do in the human in the loop training to make sure. And by the way, that constantly happens. We're thinking about all sorts of different types of imaging outside of radiology. And so we're constantly asking those questions of the physicians that are helping us develop technology. So all that to say, Jason, that problem is really getting a lot easier with AI. And actually, one of the things I'm working on right now is a bit of an internal research paper where we're looking at, we have something like 15 million radiology schedule messages that we can look at in aggregate. And one of the things I'm trying to figure out is what actually is the real world % adoption of standardized procedure descriptions, and then more specifically, those procedure descriptions being passed to downstream systems like Medicom. And so hopefully I'll have that data soon and I can publish that. But, I suspect it's low, but we'll find out as we finish that internal research and be happy to share that with you. The last thing that people are concerned about with these types of automated workflows is this going to put a lot of load on our PACS? And, people, the PACS was not designed to handle hundreds of thousands of queries. Think about it this way. If Hurley and Michigan are constantly sharing exams, every time you have an appointment at Michigan, you might query Hurley to see what's going on, right? Well, Michigan does millions of procedures a year. So, to put millions of queries onto the Hurley PACS, that's a big ask, especially if a health system hasn't moved to a new enterprise imaging platform in the cloud. That's a big ask from a computation and API workload perspective. So what we do is we have this free app called Patient Match, where we actually query the EHR first. So we'll say to the EHR, hey, we're looking for Jason. Here's his date of birth. Here's his address. Here's his phone number. Here's what we've got on him. And then we tell the EHR, give us a high confidence match. And if the EHR gives us a high confidence match, we proceed with querying the PACS to determine what study descriptions are out there. And then based on those study descriptions, the AI is determining what's relevant. And so we can run the bulk number of queries through open FHIR endpoints that are designed with this type of system in mind. And there are plenty of other examples in healthcare IT where you have automated retrieval of records between institutions. I mean, most EHRs offer an interoperability solution like this. And so it's really about bridging that gap in imaging. And those are some of the barriers that we think about. Is the data relevant? Is the AI getting the right stuff and we don't have to manage a compendium? Are we matching the patient with the EHR versus the PACS? Because again, 3 points is not safe and the PACS aren't designed to handle mass patient matching workloads. And then the third thing really is, are we using the right types of appointments and procedures to drive that? And when we think about institutions like Michigan Medicine, it's not just a radiology procedure, right? You've got an orthopedic surgery consult, you have an oncology consult, you have radiation therapists and the radiation oncologists want to get the images for treatment planning. There's a lot of types of appointments that could trigger that event. We really believe that this should be happening in the background automatically, that AI should be taking use and access, and patients should have the ability to share, but their expectation should be that their data follows them from one provider to another automatically.
I've actually been taking little notes because you triggered a bunch of thoughts, and I'm evaluating which one to go first. I guess first thing I'll say is it's great to hear Cheryl Peters-Selge's name. She's a friend of mine, and we've sat on a board together, so that's nice that she was involved in this. One of these things I think that's an interesting debate is this idea of patient access, because obviously the patient should be empowered. The patient should be able to access their results. I don't think as a patient I broke my foot just a couple of weeks ago. Seeing the images and having access to them means nothing to me. But if I can be ensured that they get to go to where they need to go, exactly what you're saying, that's the cherry on the cupcake right there. Well, some of the things that you've touched on are things that we've evaluated here when I was working for a health information exchange in Ontario. And you mentioned, for example, the social security number. So sometimes we don't have a strong EMPI in place, but there are strong attributes that we can use as a deterministic match. Years ago, there was a paper that we had put out that evaluated using the Ontario provincial health card number versus an EMPI. And so they all have their pros and cons, but you end up finding that using some sort of a metric like that is a lot stronger than you think it will be, because there's already been a big level of due diligence. The social security number, those organizations are pretty strict about not giving duplicates. So by the time it gets down to your downstream system, there's a high degree of accuracy, you're a level of confidence that you're feeling.
I think our experience inside VA is that with VA using the social security number, it's very easy for us to augment the patient's identity as they go from one institution to another, because we can say, look, even if the DICOM doesn't have the patient's home address, phone number, email address, there are new FHIR endpoints that will respond to first name, last name, date of birth, sex, and social security number. And so, it is a very useful tool. And I think we're a far cry away from, the ONC coming out and really having a clear strategy on a national enterprise master patient index. So, I think for imaging, this is going to continue to be a big challenge. And one of the things that we feel strongly about is that the study instance UID can serve as a universal identifier for studies. I think in theory, right, the study instance UID should be unique. The time of day and the exact time the imaging study was performed, the information about the modality that was performing it, and the information about the institution. In theory, you can't scan two patients at the exact same time on the same piece of equipment at the same institution.
According to IRWF, which is import reconciliation workflow, the SUID should never change. So
Exactly.
Yes.
Now, we've had this argument in a number of institutions where there are PACS vendors that say, hey, look, if you touch the demographics on this study, you got to change the SUID. And our view is that, especially with a number of EHR companies coming out and saying, hey, we're going to start doing image sharing and participating in this, they are going to need to rely on a primary key across their EHR instances. And it seems like study instance UID is the best option for doing that. A lot of these systems are based on the IHE standard. The study instance UID is a very useful component of that. As US CDI draft version 6 comes out, we saw updates to the FHIR imaging study resource. The FHIR imaging study resource is going to include transfer syntax. What that means is that you're going to be able to launch a DICOM web viewer directly from a FHIR query with the FHIR imaging study resource, but that query is going to be basically the study instance UID and the transfer syntax. And so, we feel very strongly from sort of an informatics perspective and in our interpretation of the DICOM standard that the SUID should be maintained because it's the best way of identifying a unique study for an individual patient. We're constantly dealing with all sorts of sort of foreign films for people, right? They might have encounter-based imaging workflows where they have an ultrasound going into a long-term care facility. They might have CDs that a patient brought in that a front desk person imported through a Smart on FHIR app inside the EHR that we offer. They might have teleradiology workflows with other institutions. They might be getting priors from all sorts of places. And so, for us, the study instance UID is an important aspect of determining whether or not the study's available to the clinicians already. So we really are trying our best to encourage health systems to, interpret the DICOM standard in that way, because there are a lot of legacy image sharing systems that every time you make an update to the study, you're getting a new study instance UID, and that's going to wreak havoc. So that's one of our fundamental beliefs about the DICOM standard, and we hope the coming regulatory changes sort of cement that and codify that understanding of the imaging study. And then when you have that, you can start to tap into all sorts of data sources. You've got the on-ramps to TEFCA and the RCEs that have additional demographics. Think about if they have the study instance UIDs as well. You have state-sponsored health information exchanges. You've done great work in the state of Oklahoma and Montana, and they have additional demographics that can help us match. And obviously the health systems in those regions benefit from that. And then we have our apps where we're constantly trying to add things like home address, phone number, email address to a study. I want to, Jason, just quickly go back to your question about patients, though, because this is something that's important for patients as well. I think we think a lot about in terms of, well, what happens when you get an imaging study as a patient and you want to see it or share it, right? And kind of your comment earlier, it's like, well, what are really the important use cases for patients that we think about? And one of the things we hear a lot about is, well, our patient population isn't quite savvy to deal with this. Well, the response to that is, it's probably because the technology we're offering them is bad, right? Like, they should be able to go into their EHR portal, click a button that says view my images, view them in a simple viewer on their iPhone. And, if they want to see that or take a screenshot or send it to somebody, that's their business to do that. But actually, I think one of the bigger problems is that people are very anxious to get prepared for an appointment. Take, for example, you get into a major cancer center because you have a rare carcinoma, and you want to make sure that your oncologist that you're going to have a consult with has access to all your prior images. I mean, it's very important. Patients who are dealing with complex health issues across multiple institutions where they're going to see subspecialty clinicians, they're really on top of their records and they want to make sure their provider has the full view. So coming back to your earlier question, one of the big emphasis we put on this is building an app called Patient Upload. And the idea is that when a patient gets scheduled for an appointment that has imaging, to send the patient a message through their EHR patient portal that says, hey, upload your images for your appointment. Now, when we were asked by a major health system in New York City, I can't make disclosure of who, to build this application with them and to partner with them. And sort of our initial response, Jason, was like, do we really think patients are going to do this? It's like, you have a mammogram next week. What images do you have? Try to upload your images. One of the things that we've been very surprised about is the adoption of that platform is much more than we imagined. Now, again, in this particular setting, we're dealing with patients in New York City, so it's a different demographic of patients. But at the end of the day, we're seeing large volumes of imaging studies, double-digit percentages of the health system's total exchange volume being uploaded by patients. So, and there's other things that have to happen to make this workflow make sense, right? Because, for example, if you're a provider in an institution and you want images, you want images, right? So you put your request in, or in some institutions, you put an order in your EHR, and then the order gets associated to the exam once it comes in, and it updates the encounter. And, you get all this workflow stuff that notifies you about that. So this is something where FHIR does fall a little bit short for us, where we've built proprietary APIs with EHR vendors, where we will update things like the daily appointment report or the appointment roster to say like, hey, you should check out the encounter because the patient uploaded images and you probably didn't request it, or you might not even know about it. So we do our best to try to notify the clinician so the clinician can close the loop with the patient. But going back to your earlier thing, how does the patient know whether or not the images they have are the images their clinician has?
Mm-hmm.
And so this goes back to the whole thing with study instance UID. So let's say, for sake of discussion, that big cancer center, they use Smart Search, they queried for stuff, they imported stuff, they did all sorts of things. You need a record of all the study instance UIDs, and you need to have trust that the study instance UIDs are going to be unique, so that when the patient goes to share, it says, hey, we don't have those images. Thank you so much. Really helpful. Or it says, hey, you know what? Your clinician already has these images. Here's the information on it. Do you have something more in these images? Do you want to upload them again? What do you want to do? So this is a very important aspect, and we have to close the loop with the patient so that they know either they've provided the clinician with something they didn't or already did have. And then, the final thing that we've learned about this is that most of the uploading is happening on mobile. So, you think about a patient uploading their images, you think, oh, you got to have a CD burner / ingester. Nobody has a CD drive, that sort of thing. I think we're way past that, actually. And that's like one of the biggest objections we hear when we talk about adoption of this is like, oh, well, patients don't have CD drives, and most of them don't have computers. People have iPads, or they have tablets and phones, but they don't have a desktop OS that they can work off of. And so what we see is that people are uploading from their file system on their iPhone. They're uploading from Google Drive. They're uploading from their iCloud account. And so really the conclusion that we've drawn is that, a lot of patient portals offer an ability to download DICOM, and patients take advantage of that. And then they put it into their record, they keep a copy of it, and they can upload it from their phone. And so this is the world that we live in. And, while we believe that, this should be automated in the background, automated access and use of images, patients play an important part. And we have to sort of take it at face value and take it for what it is. They have these images on their phone, and they can upload them on their phone. And that's what we should expect.
You had talked about relevancy back in the day when we were doing this at the Health Information Exchange in Ontario. Two of the very first sites that had what we call foreign exam management, we didn't set any restrictions. They got absolutely everything, which was not the most efficient way of sharing priors. But it was very interesting in those early days to hear the feedback from the doctors, because there was I remember Dr. Matt Downey from Quinty Healthcare, and he had this story where there was no prior chest X-ray, but there was a prior shoulder. And there was enough of the lung in the shoulder that he could use as a prior. And I always think of that in the sense of sometimes what we define as being relevant in our terms by like words. But if it was a machine that's defining the body parts and the adjacency, that becomes a different story. And along those same lines, so there's the concept of relevancy in that respect. And then the idea of patient identity. And I'm waiting for someone to come along and do this eventually, where Dr. Judy Gachoya from Emory had published a paper a few years back, and they had stripped out all of the metadata within the header information of the DICOM, and you would still, to a high degree of accuracy, identify the race of the patient. And the paper was centered around what are the implications on that? Could that have negative impacts? But there's also this context of, if you can get that close with everything stripped out of it, could you create a patient matching model? My pacemaker, I don't have a pacemaker, but if I were to, it wouldn't change. My bone structure doesn't significantly change over time, and unless there's some reason why. And then now I have this fingerprint of me as an individual, and then pairing that with the concept of understanding, not looking at the terms of what the body parts are and what's relevant, but looking at it from the pixels. Your thoughts?
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, let me start with the relevancy question. I think before image sharing became a really sophisticated aspect of enterprise imaging, the sort of modus operandi was to get images from an outside institution and then put them into the imaging archive. And without really any sort of discernment about the patient matching, the relevancy, maybe people are making small changes to the DICOM header to identify studies as coming from an outside source, but really not all that sophisticated. What we see at leading academic institutions now is that there's a very deliberate process to get an order into the EHR, whether that order be for a consult or an archive. And there are so many ways you can do that, right? You could place the order in your EHR and then use FHIR and then surface the open orders inside the image sharing application. You can use DICOM modality worklist, especially in institutions where there's sort of a unique difference between orderables that might be in the EHR and performables that end up down to the imaging archive. There's, of course, the issue of when you want a consult order, you need a physician's signature because you're going to drop a professional services charge. So now that institutions have gotten much more sophisticated about that, there's a lot more discernment about like, hey, do we need this imaging study? And oh, by the way, do we need this imaging study to be overread as well? We even have some institutions where, they'll get a combination exam, like a CT abdomen, pelvis, chest, and then they'll want to split that into 3 overread orders because they have a subspecialty radiologist who's going to look at chest, one that's going to look at abdomen, and one that's going to look at pelvis. So, there's so much sophistication there. I think the key, though, from a workflow perspective is being able to present all of that information inside the EHR, whether that be things like us surfacing a FHIR endpoint that then serves up the EHR where they can order from the FHIR endpoint and then it gets stored in. It could be us having a Smart on FHIR app where we show all the available outside exams in context of a particular patient, and then they can make the decision to create an order in our system or have it automatically reconcile and use AI to do that, or place an order in their EHR and associate it that way. So I think that what has happened over time is there's this increasing level of discernment as these systems start integrating better and better as they have, as the FHIR standard and the deployment of Smart on FHIR apps has become commonplace versus something that might be accessible only in 1 or 2 leading EHRs. I mean, we see this across lots of different EHRs, including EHRs for small oncology practices. Right. So that's the first thing. And so, we really, that allows us to engage the clinician in this question of, is this relevant to you? And to be able to show them the images inside the EHR without storing them, without getting an order, and then giving them these workflow options that are super simple where they would place the order and have the imaging studies automatically stored. So I think that as time goes on, we're going to continue to see more and more of that, and the interoperability and integration of these systems getting even stronger. To your question about identifying the patient sort of with pixels, we've had this idea floating around several times. And, there are some very alarming papers that show that de-identified imaging studies, basically just as you said from the case that came out of Emory, de-identified imaging studies really aren't de-identified at all. In fact, even if you carefully scrub through burned in PHI on an ultrasound and you get rid of all the secondary capture images and, you can reconstruct somebody's face, especially with AI, you can reconstruct somebody's face with a high resolution MRI image. And so we see de-identified imaging as another interoperability use case. It fits within that same category of sharing with a patient or another provider. You're just sharing with a researcher. And the data is in a bit of a different form. But we are constantly concerned by this issue because we think a lot of data that AI companies use and that have been sort of not had to go through an IRB process because the data is not human subject, because it's de-identified, is really sort of a misnomer. And I think that while, people work very hard to live within the safe harbor that the privacy rule creates for de-identification, in practice, it's very challenging. So I think on your question, Jason, while we've toyed with this idea, we have deep privacy concerns that if someone were to use AI to develop a model like this for identifying people, then you would create a situation where vast troves of de-identified data, including things on like the Cancer Imaging Archive, which is just public, available, and free online.
Which you can't get the head CTs anymore. Like
Right.
You can ask for special permission, but they're not openly available anymore.
Yeah, and I think we fear that the level of sophistication to be able to identify individuals by their health data is going to increase such that you won't even need the head. You could look at somebody's x-ray of their foot, and if you had another identified x-ray of somebody of their lower extremities, that you'd be able to find them. So we are very safely avoiding that topic, and we're not going to contribute to research in that area for sure.
I think that's always the double-edged sword, is that the technology may exist, but the privacy concerns loom too heavy overhead. Hopefully everyone kind of carries that same concern moving forward.
We hope so. We hope that no enterprise imaging developers go down that path. It's a dangerous one.
And so earlier, you mentioned University of Michigan, and you also had mentioned other areas beyond radiology. I actually, at SIM, I guess about a month and a half ago in Pittsburgh, I was talking to a pathologist from University of Michigan, and he was talking about Medicom. And so can you expand on what does it mean when you are sharing outside of radiology? Maybe the recipient for this it's not going to be going to a PACS necessarily. Talk us through that. So you've got pathology, cardiology, derm, oncology. Share what that looks like as we start looking at enterprise imaging exchange.
Yeah, Jason, as you point out, image exchange has been a radiology-dominated practice. And Dr. Buckwalter, was the assistant CMIO for imaging at Michigan Medicine, and he's retired now. And he left a really strong imprint on us, like, hey, we bought this in radiology, but our job is to serve everybody else, right? And that perspective needs to be everywhere that we go with radiology image exchange. I think when we look at it, there are three things that we have to look at for every ology that wants to adopt imaging interoperability. Number one is the context. Where is the clinician working, right? We know when a radiologist wants to see priors, they want it to hang properly in their PACS, right? It's very simple. We need an order. We need to put it in the jacket. We need to modify the study description, body part, laterality, modality, so that the hanging protocols recognize the study. And then when they pull up the current mammogram and the priors right next to it from the other institution automatically, we have a very happy radiologist, right? But that's not true in the context of many other ologies. And I think not just of the image producing ologies like cardiology and pathology, but also the consuming ologies like oncology, right? And orthopedic surgery. And so that's really the big first question is like, what is the context in which they want or need access to the imaging studies? And for the most part, it's not searching the PACS and the hanging protocol working properly. For the most part, it's surfacing the imaging data within the EHR in the context of an encounter, whether that encounter be an orthopedic surgery consult, a breast surgery consult, or even a radiation physicist looking at their roster of appointments needing to get the DICOM to build the treatment plan. So that's the first thing. What is the context? And for us, that problem is easy to solve because most of our apps are available as smart on FHIR apps that can be integrated into the EHR's experience. So you can sort of put the button to launch our workflow app wherever you live. So, but that's the first big question is well, what's driving it? One thing I love reminding people of is, we'll say, well, how are we going to get the orthopedic surgeon their priors? And it's whoa, hang on a second. They don't see this as a prior exam. Yeah. That's radiology speak. This is the exam that they're going to use to prepare for their consult or determine whether or not they can do this. It's not a prior exam. It's an exam that they need to perform the service. So, what is that? And when you define that, it starts to make sense about well, what's the context in which we should present this study to this outside exam to the clinician? So that's thing number one. Thing number two is standardization. And this is the age-old topic, how are we defining the study? I love Cheryl Petersilge's example about this of going into an institution where the dermatologist takes a picture of somebody's hand and it's the top of their hand. And then the radiologist takes a picture of the wrist and the hand and its lower, its upper extremities, right? It's that makes no sense. For us, using AI to sort of decipher that is really the way to go because it's going to be impossible to reach standardization. It's a pipe dream. in our opinion. Again, I'm working on this research, but we'll see. And we really think AI can play the role in translating what that means in one thing, one ontology to another and make that a much faster process. The other thing about sort of meaning and understanding of the different ontologies and data types is just to your earlier question, like what is exactly relevant in this situation, right? And again, it's in many cases, it's not what a radiologist might be looking at, a region of interest or a body part, or to your earlier example, you have a CT of the shoulder and an X-ray of the chest, and yeah, the AI can figure out there's some lung there, let's take a look. But when you're thinking about doing a complex interventional radiology procedure where you're delivering a chemotherapy, the question of what's relevant in that context is much different and very complex. So there's that issue, which is the types of data sources. And the other sort of issue there is just getting to standard data sets. I mean, we see this in pathology. It's not hard to convert all these proprietary formats into DICOM. In fact, it's super easy. There are open source projects like OpenSlide where these are solved problems. Like, if people are sitting around hemming and hawing about, well, it's in this proprietary XYZ vendor format and we got to get it to DICOM. That's no big deal. That's a solved problem. That's a very solved problem. The problem with it actually is computational cost, right? Because if we have to take imaging data that's in a PNG and then bring it into our cloud and then process it, and it's 10 gigabytes, and then you got to convert it to DICOM, that takes a lot of compute and a lot of network egress fees and storage fees. I mean, the going rate is 9 cents a gigabyte for egress, and the going rate for, high throughput JPEG 2000 storage of imaging data in the cloud for high throughput JPEG 2000 streaming is 20 cents a gigabyte a month. So, if you have to take imaging data into the cloud to convert it from some proprietary pathology format to DICOM, that might be a couple bucks. That's a lot of money. And so in our view, the objective of having DICOM as the standard isn't a technical problem. It's just a cost problem. And then the third and final thing is workflow. And when I say workflow, really what I mean is change management, right? Because the workflow in cardiology and pathology is so different from radiology. I'll give you an example. When you have a slide in pathology, right? It's part of a case. The case has an accession number, but so does the slide. So if you have one slide that is H&E staining, and then you have another slide that is part of the same specimen, but you're going to do immunohistochemistry, you end up having an accession number for each of those. And then those accession numbers roll up to the accession number for the study. So then the question becomes, well, if you're going to be looking at an outside pathology exam, do you need the specificity of all of those orders to build the case? Or is it okay to have this one parent order? And that's a very different model than radiology where, you wouldn't generate an accession number for every series in a study. I mean, if I told you, Jason, hey, we're going to implement this thing and every time you have a new series, you're going to have you'd think we're crazy. But in pathology, that's the way it works. And there's really good reason for that. So the point becomes you've got to understand what these unique workflows are. And, I think that's what makes us special at Medicom is that imaging interoperability is all we do all day. I mean, it's like we wake up every morning, it's our waking passion. We go to bed every night, we're thinking about it, right? And so, I think Orlando Bravo said it best at Davos last year. In the age of AI, the franchise value of a software company is its domain expertise. Because it's not about what you can build, it's about what you should, right? We're not building AI agents to answer phone calls. We're not building a dictation software. We are 100% focused on these deep issues of imaging interoperability. So when you think about the subject matter expertise, why that matters is because then you can really go deep and understand what the exact workflow is of the pathologist. You can understand it, and then you can build to those requirements. You can sort of bring the customer along with you by helping them shift left in your organization and help them define what those requirements are versus saying, hey, here's a finished product, do you like it? Right? So that's the sort of mentality that we take when we want to understand the workflow. And I'll go back to that big health system in New York City. We're expanding out to cardiology right now. And They have a different process for getting orders. They have a different process for doing consults. They have a different process for thinking about priors. And we can't live in a world where we say, well, this is the way radiology does it. It needs to work for everybody. Oh, this is the ontology we use. It needs to work for everybody. This is the workflow we use. It needs to work for everybody. We need to be very specific. So in summary, Jason, we've got to present the information in the right context. Outside of radiology, it might not be a hanging protocol in an imaging archive or an enterprise viewer. We've got to do deep integrations to the EHR, manage these ontologies and different terminologies and we have to make sure that we fully understand what their workflow is and then adapt the solutions to meet those. And some of those workflows might seem repugnant to a radiologist, but that's okay. I mean, that's the nature of meeting the needs of the enterprise imaging service lines within the health system.
This has been an amazing conversation. And as you said, it's not a matter of if you can build it, if you should build it. I know firsthand the ability of giving a clinician access to imaging has such a significant impact to the patient's life. And like we've all either been a patient or we have loved ones that are, so it's very significant. And it's great work that you guys are doing here. I'd like to just close out with the idea. Sometimes we can get weighed down by the fun of the technology and we can get too far into that. But there is some interesting policy initiatives that are coming out. And we alluded to it earlier where Canada, due to some significant federal investment and then down at the provincial level, we built out infrastructure that allowed this sharing to take place about 15 plus years ago. There is something that's happening right now in the United States with an RFI. And I'd love you to maybe close out by articulating what that RFI is in your mind and where it could potentially go and how the benefits that you could see that it could lend itself to.
Yeah, Jason, well, first of all, thanks again for having me on today as we wrap up here. And just want to say that, our team has so valued the imaging informatics learning, and whether it be people in finance or sales or operations or even recruiting that are getting the opportunity to go deeper on imaging informatics through all of your educational programs. It's been hugely beneficial to our organization. And, our culture is to embrace the complexity of these issues. And it really takes fundamental understanding of imaging informatics to do that. So we're excited about that. And it's the same approach that we're taking to the regulatory changes as well. I think that we feel like imaging has long been excluded from the mandates across health IT. Obviously with the American Recovery and Reconstruction Act, outpatient radiology practices have sort of been exempt from getting ONC certified EHRs or having the penalty and incentives for doing it. So it kind of comes back to like, put your money where your mouth is, right? And we know that that's going to change, and it's changing soon. That's coming out of the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. We expect soon that they're going to tell outpatient radiology practices, hey, you've got a risk, that's great, but you now have to meet the ONC certification criteria for an EHR. We think that that's going to drastically change the perspective, because it's going to go from interoperability being a nice to have to interoperability being core to the certification criteria of their primary system of record outside images. But going one step further, we're so excited to see Dr. Thomas Keene leading the Office of the National Coordinator, to have an interventional radiologist who's well published in informatics and a great technology thinker who understands the clinical, operational, and technology problems related to imaging interoperability, and to be at the helm of the change that's coming. This is the long-standing thing that we've been waiting for the government to come in and say, hey, image exchange isn't a nice to have. It's a requirement. You have to modernize. You have to get to a digital platform. Here are incentives to do that. Here are penalties if you don't do that. And we're very hopeful that the government is going to set the bar high, that they're going to say, hey, look, DICOM web, that's not a nice to have. That's a certification requirement. And by the way, you can't charge people for it. And having FHIR endpoints for patient matching, not a nice to have. That's a requirement. Having a more than 3-point patient match, a DICOM 3-point patient match, not safe, illegal. You need 4 points. You need 5 points. That's the safe thing to do. That's our expectation. And so we're very excited that they are coming along and doing this, because we think that the issues of image exchange can be solved if it just becomes free and available for people to use the imaging study FHIR resource, to use DICOM Web, to use all these new cloud technologies like high throughput JPEG 2000. So we're very enthusiastic about what the ONC is doing, and we hope that they'll see it through and go from the proposed rule that had 100 or so comments on it from lots of institutions and vendors and organizations like the ACR and the RSNA. We hope they'll go from that proposed rule to a final rule and start holding organizations accountable to digital image exchange, including codifying the information blocking requirements that go along with that. So we're excited, and this is a great time to be building in this space. And we're hopeful that as image exchange goes from this sort of closed down proprietary thing to open, like all other interoperability products, that we'll see a renaissance of new companies, technologies, innovations that can do new things when image exchange becomes the standard, digital image exchange becomes the standard, open, free, interoperable way. And for us as an organization, that gets us to focus on not, hey, who's on your network? Who are you exchanging with? But more about what's the workflow? Are we presenting the right information at the right time? How are we getting the patient engaged with this process? And those are really the problems that health systems want to solve. Because for a health system CFO, without this penalty or the mandate and without focus on the broader change management issues, who cares about interoperability for the sake of interoperability?
100%. Yeah, that's well said. I think
the magic of the scene, interoperability, the dream machine. DICOM, HL7, IHE, and Snap. We're building the future, never looking back.